why we are here. Welcome to the library. I'm so glad you could come tonight as part of our summer programming this year. We've been having so much fun with the theme of design. And we've been working with tiny children, and we've been working with school-age children, we've been working with adults, and we've been looking at all the different ways that you can define design. And here we are again tonight talking about another way to design. I'm not going to go on about Laurie R because you know her and you're here. I'm a lover of her books too. I love Mary Russell. I've read all 14 of the books and many of the short stories and several of the others. And Laurie is going to talk to us tonight about the biggest mystery of all to those of us who don't write. How do you build a book? Welcome, Laurie.
I guarantee you it's a mystery to us too. Before I start, I just wanted to say thank you for coming out, even at this odd hour, and why aren't you home in your garden, everyone? But I also wanted to say that I have another hat I wear occasionally, and that is I am the president of the Northern California chapter of the Mystery Writers of America. Now, MWA is a great organization. We welcome people of all levels of publishing, including just people who like to read. There are a couple of brochures over here you are welcome to take as you wander in and out. There's some brochures about the organization, and there's also our events calendar of things that are coming up. And one of the reasons I'm mentioning it now is that I will be back here in October, I think around the 19th. I think it's the 19th. We are doing one of our MWA NorCal stops in Mystery Week. We have a Mystery Week for the Bay Area. And we will have a panel of mostly local writers and me. So put that on your calendar right now. So that's the sponsorship acknowledgement, because we all love libraries and that's why we're here, but MWA especially loves libraries. What I thought I'd talk about tonight will sort of depend on you. And this will give you an idea of those of us who are, a friend and I wrote a book about writing called Crime and Thriller Writing, Michelle Spring. And we both started by writing about 20 or 30 pages and then exchanging it so that we could each see where the other person was coming from. Her 20 or 30 pages was basically about how any real writer outlines. Mine was, the only people who outline are tight asses. And we looked at each other across the internet and said, this is interesting. So we came up with the terms organic, moi, and organized, her. Now, I don't think that you can teach a style of writing. Anyone who's here tonight hoping that I teach them how to write is probably would be better watching Game of Thrones at home. I think that there are certain ways of writing that are inborn. And I know that I find it impossible to be an organized writer. Now, the rest of my life is relatively organized, but when it comes to telling stories, I find that that an outline only goes so far before I just run dry, and I can't visualize it at all. So that my first drafts are basically my outline. They are my 300-page outline that tells me what the book is going to be. This means that when I show my editor the first draft, if ever I have to have a new editor, they will probably cancel my contract. Because what I give them is utterly unpublishable. It is, you know the English phrase, a dog's dinner? A dog's dinner is all that stuff that you kind of spoon down and mix up and the dog says, ugh. And that's what the editor says is, ew. But it is me basically getting the machinery going. So if you are expecting me to give you bullet points on how to write, you can put your pencils away right now. Because that's not what you're going to get. Now, can I have an idea, first of all, how many people have not read The Murder of Mary Russell? Good, because I don't want to do spoilers, so okay. If you all had read it and knew it, I could talk about the ending, but I'm not going to do that. Can I also ask how many people here are writers or would-be writers? Okay, so you're interested in craft as well. The rest of you, you'll just have to go along with the rest. So what I thought I would talk about, because this is a summer where structure is the focus, is how this particular book came about. Murder of Mary Russell. Now, I was actually in the midst of writing another book, a book that became Lockdown, which is there on the back, when I went to a conference in, I think it was in Long Beach. The BoucherCon is the big crime conference they hold every year, named after Anthony Boucher. And I always go to this primarily because I get to see my editor, and she and I have a long hour or two discussion on what I'm doing and what I should be doing and what I could be doing. My daughter is my agent now, and so this was a 3-person meeting around this table once everyone had had their coffee and gotten rid of the last batch of coffee. So we sat down there, and someone had brought up an idea to my editor, whose name is Kate, that Kate just sort of threw out there, and she said, I don't know, have you ever thought of killing off your main character? And until that point, I had not. About 5 minutes later, my daughter looks over and realizes that I've heard nothing for 5 minutes. She realizes that Mom is staring out the window in this hotel room, and Mom's brain is going, and she keeps Kate in earnest conversation while Mom's brain works out, have you ever thought of killing your main character? And when we finished our coffee, I said, that's a really interesting idea. And that was where The Murder of Mary Russell came about. For those of you who don't know, my main character, who has been in 14 novels at this point, is named Mary Russell. So when the title was announced, there was a certain amount of consternation among my fans, because, of course, there are 2 ways of taking that title. One of them is, she dies. And I kept my lips tightly shut on that topic until the book actually came out, which I thought was very, very good of me. And people who read advance copies did too. Because what I wanted to do with the book, and it's interesting how a single seed like that can start a book. I often have people who come to me and say, oh, I have a great idea for a book, and before they can get any further than that, I say, I think that's the story you need to write, which always takes them aback because they haven't actually told me their idea. But you know, I always say it's a great idea, even if I haven't heard it, because a single idea is not a book. A single idea is just an idea. It isn't until you start getting more than one idea in there that you have a relationship between this idea and that idea, that you have 2 seeds that can grow together and make something really interesting. That is what plot is all about. This idea that you have a single story, that is the murder of Mary Russell. But you also have something that, for example, with this book, I had long wanted to look at Sherlock Holmes's backstory. Now, again, some of you probably know that Mary Russell and Sherlock Holmes are partners. For those of you who don't, my character, Mary Russell, and Sherlock Holmes are partners. They become partners in The Beekeeper's Apprentice, and then in the second book they become closer partners, and by the third one they're an old married couple because it was just easier that way. So I always, when I first started writing the Russell stories, I made sure that everyone knew these were Mary Russell stories. Holmes always got second billing. He was always a supporting character. And I was very firm that these are not Sherlock Holmes pastiches. People persist in saying, oh, I love those Sherlock Holmes stories that you write. And for the first 7 or 8 of them, I used to correct them and say, oh, you mean the Mary Russell stories? And they'd say, oh, yeah, that's her name. But after a while, I started being more interested in the character of Sherlock Holmes. I started thinking about, here's a man that Arthur Conan Doyle first killed off, and then sort of dragged back because he needed to pay his bills. And then ended at the very eve of the Great War, because he really could not imagine Sherlock Holmes during the war or after the war. He just couldn't picture that possibility. This Victorian gentleman didn't belong in this changed society where women wore short skirts and did things like, deliver beer during the time when men were off in the trenches. And I began to think, this is selling the guy short. I think that mind of a character like Sherlock Holmes would have been supple enough to find a new place in a changed world. So at about 6 or 7 books in, I think you find me looking more closely at Holmes as a character. I think you find me talking about the effect that Russell is having on him as well as he is having on her. Because I treated him as my character instead of just someone that is this sort of paradigm on which she is based. But I was always interested in how he came about. What is his backstory? Russell's backstory from fairly early on. Not all of it, but you learn it as you go along. But Holmes's backstory is certainly never given in any of the Conan Doyle stories. And there are a couple of early stories that mention he's very young, but he's not really any different. So I thought, what would he look like? How would his backstory set up a situation that leads to the murder of Mary Russell? Well, one of the very earliest cases, in fact, the earliest case, not published, but in the Holmes timeline, is called The Glorious God Adventure. And it starts in 1855 with a man who's on a ship that there's a mutiny, and he takes part in it. But anyway, the man's name is Hudson. In fact, he's no relation at all to our Mrs. Hudson, the housekeeper of Baker Street. It was just that, Conan Doyle was not the kind of writer to keep a list of his character names that he's used before, or situations that he used before. He tended to just reuse them. He has, I think, 4 or 5 different characters named Hudson, none of whom are related to each other. However, there's no reason why they couldn't be. So I went into the chronology, a very close, detailed look at the chronology. And fortunately, Conan Doyle is very fuzzy on that, too. Which is a real advantage for those of us who want to mess around in the history. Because it occurred to me that if you have a blood relationship between that Hudson, the bad guy, Mr. Hudson, the one that involves Sherlock Holmes' very first case where he's blackmailing a friend of Holmes's from university, Oxford University, not Cambridge. Long arguments about that. That if she and this other Hudson were related, how would that be? And how would that relationship play out in a way that would then lead to 1925 and the murder of Mary Russell? So there's all these different things that come together, and that's your plot. That's how I build a plot, is playing with the ideas. Sometimes they're external, like the ideas of Hudson and Holmes. those are set points in the universe. I can't mess around too much with them. I mess around with them a little, but people argue with me if I mess around with them too much. Because I'm sure it will astonish you to find that people take Sherlock Holmes very seriously. I'm sure it will astonish you. So that is where this book started. So I then had to look at what kind of research, what don't I know? And it turns out to be a hell of a lot. Because by now I'm pretty good with the 1920s. I mean, I've been living there a long time, and I can, sort of even give you the differences between the 25 that we've gotten up to in Russell and the 26 to 9 that the Stuyvesant and Gray series are in. So, we're okay with the 20s. But this is Victorian times, and we're starting back in 1855 when the ship goes sailing off in order to be mutinied. And so I have to then start all over again, all my research all over again. Now, 20 years ago, trying to do any research at all online was a sort of exercise in frustration. The most you could hope for was to have a name that kept popping up that you could find who'd written books and was still alive and you could write to them, and they'd say, who? But that was about as much as you could hope for. Or you'd find some local museum, and so next time you went to England, you could go to the clothing museum that had women's underwear and say, oh, that's what that looks like, okay, cinch that up and pull that there. Gotcha. Now, it's amazing what you can find online. So, of course, it's amazing what you can find that's wrong online too. But, by persisting, my background is academic, so I have a degree from UCSC and a real degree from UC Berkeley. From a graduate theological union in Berkeley, I have an MA. So, I mean, my research is where I'm comfortable, and sometimes too comfortable, and you get bogged down in research, and then you never get the book written, which I'm sure none of you have ever come across. But the interesting thing with the Victorian stuff is that not only were the Victorians writing it down themselves, but people are interested in the Victorian era. So you have, for example, I needed to have people on a clipper ship, right? Because you need to get from here to there quickly, and so you get on a clipper ship and you sail. Well, I never sailed on a clipper ship. I mean, I've been on those tall boats that they do these sailing, and they shoot cannon at each other, and people get seasick, and then you go in. But a long-term sail ship, that's a whole different world. But you dig away and you find that there's these websites that have transcribed the diaries of passengers between London and Australia in the 19th century. And you can go in and there'll be people, these little guys who are the swinging lanterns in their cabins will write down, we lost one person today, we wrapped him and dumped him over the back, and it was a nice service, and there were only 3 worms in my porridge this morning for breakfast, and I think I have scurvy, and oh, it's a lovely day, it's only rained 3 times. But that kind of thing, a diary, is so valuable when it comes to writing real life. Anything that is one step away, that is a history of the sailing industry, is helpful for the long picture. But when it comes to the feel of the feel of maggots in your teeth, you really need a diary, right? And so things like that, I mean, I just found really fascinating, the clipper ship things and sailing around the Horn. In Australia itself, there's a museum that deals with this part of Sydney called the Rocks, and it was where the poorest of the poor lived. And they now have this photographic resource that you can look at and see the pictures of kids playing in the streets, the dirt streets. There's a lot of stuff available on, for example, the gold fields. And so as I went through and was doing all these research, the book sort of took place. So you have this guy who goes to Australia. He sends for his wife, who manages to get there with their small child. And this small child is Mrs. Hudson. So it is her growing up, first in Australia, becoming a criminal like her father, going to England, and meeting a very young Sherlock Holmes. And it's so fun because you're working through this whole, I mean, there's what, 50, 100 pages of her story, working up to that meeting. And you just wait because that meeting is going to be such fun to write. And you know, knowing that all of the readers who are going to pick this up are also waiting because they know that this young guy is going to appear in her life sooner or later. And sure enough, there he is. Now, I would like to pause here and ask if there's anything specific that you would like me to talk about that I haven't yet. And I will repeat questions for those of you in the back and for this machine that's taping things. Yeah.
I'd just like you to talk about your writing process, like when you decide you're going to start on a new book and you do research, do you try to have any schedule? Do you just try to go with today I feel like writing?
The question is about my writing process and schedule. Part of the schedule question involves how long I have.
Uh-huh.
So that if what I like to do is to take 3 months, 4 months to write a first draft. And as I said, my first draft is very, very rough. It has the machinery of the plot so that I know that when I turn the handle here, it moves there and it comes out the other end and everything works. I then have to turn that raw piece of machinery into a novel with characters who live and breathe, with a place that makes you aware of it, and with enough of that sort of subtext that leaves a taste in your mouth when you finish. And that takes probably longer than the first draft. So if a first draft takes me 4 months, a rewrite takes me six or seven. Because I am a part of a large publishing house, I have a very set schedule.
Oh.
If I miss getting a book in on time, it throws everything off. I can't just say to them, look, it's not really very good, I'm going to take another 6 months, because it's been in the catalog for that long.
Mm-hmm.
Now, I'm coming across this right now because I have a book that was due in July.
Mm-hmm.
I am, as I said, the president of NorCal MWA, and I've had a lot of work to do with that this spring, and it has just eaten my life up. So my book that I should have started probably February, I started, my editor is never going to watch this so I can tell her, because otherwise she'd give her a heart attack. I started it less than a month ago. It's due early August. The first draft. That's all they're going to get, is the first draft. But that works out to 2,000 words a day. If I can do 2,000 words a day, I can finish the book by the first week of August. Now, yesterday I did 500. Today I did 2,200. The day before I did 2,400. So, you know, it balances out. But it means that I don't have time to do other stuff, except come here because my brain is dead by 3 or 4, and so that's it. But I am working. I am working full time now. So if anyone wants me to do anything, no, you're not. no, not till September. But normally I like to take longer because I like to think about the pieces at a bit more leisurely. And I like to do more research that leads me to a given point rather than just wildly flailing about. But you know, as I said, if I couldn't get this in by the end of summer, it would be a problem for Random House, and it would mean that I don't have a book out at all in 2018, because they don't have any spaces left except for the one that I have taken up in June. So it's one of the drawbacks of being in my kind of publishing. If you are self-published or with a small press, quite often you can be more flexible. If you are with a big publishing house, you are a small cog in a large machine. It's part of the reality of life. I often wonder what my books would be if I could take 2 years with them rather than get them out in a year. I'm not sure they would be better necessarily. They would be different. They would be different. It'd undoubtedly be longer. But to give you an idea of the rhythm of publishing, my editor and I will discuss, usually not quite so dramatically as the one for Murder of Mary Russell, but we will discuss beforehand what it is I'm going to do next. I always have a contract that tells what I am going to do next in very general terms. It's a Russell, or it's a non-Russell, or it's a this, and roughly when it's due. So that I talk with her and I say what I'd like to do is X, Y, Z. For example, with Lockdown, I had given that to her and said, this is something that I would really love to do, and if you don't want it, that's fine, because I have this little team that would adore making this as my first self-published novel. And she said, well, you know, probably we're not going to be interested in it because it's short stories, it's like an anthology. And I said, well, it's not really an anthology, but let me do some work on it and then I'll show you what it is. So when I sent it to her, Lockdown is based on half a dozen short stories that are not on the surface at all related. There's no link up between any of them. In my twisted little head, they were. One of them I did for, some of you may even remember this, I was Artist of the Year for Santa Cruz in 2006, I think it was. And to celebrate that, instead of just holding a talk on the writing process, I sat and wrote. So what we did was have a thing out at the Simpkins Center. And I went up with my little laptop in one of the offices. And I just sat, and they had given me a set of prompts that morning. We had invited middle school kids to give me some prompts. And so they gave them to me at 8 that morning, and at 10 I sat down and I started writing a story. It was meant to be a short story. And I wrote for, I don't know, maybe 3 or 4 hours. And each time I hit save, it would appear on a screen down in the center. And I thought, you know, maybe there's a few people watching this online, and you know, I go down and talk to 5 people, and then I got down there and there was a huge crowd of people all saying, oh, you stopped! So that was one of the stories. It's the Nick story that's in Lockdown. So I wanted to shape these stories together. I wanted to put them together as, and the conceit is that it's a career day at a middle school. It's a middle school in this kind of Watsonville type of area. I lived there for a long time. It's a different name and different place, but it's kind of that community. And so I wrote the arc, the narrative arc that ties these stories together, and I gave her 150 pages or so. And to the great disappointment of my team, she said that she loved it and would want to do it. So that's where we went with that book. But it was a really fascinating writing process, because it was all about getting the pieces to fit together. It was all about, how do you reshape this piece so it really matches with that one? How do I take a story that's been published for 12 years and move some of the parts around so that it is part of a larger story. And I really found the process fascinating. But at any rate, that's the kind of thing that she and I do, my editor and I do, long in advance. We talk about what book we want to do next. And then I go home and write it. Some writers work much more closely with their editor as they go. They run stuff past them. I think the only time, other than lockdown, the only time I've ever given Kate a small part of a book was, I can't remember which book it was, but there was something, I couldn't tell if first or third person was working better. I had written it in third, and it just, I couldn't decide whether that was right, and so I sent it to her and we talked about that. But normally I just go away and do my thing and then send it to her, and at that point we then talk, and she gives me a list of things that need doing to it, and I have already given her a list of things that I intend to do with it, and it's amazing how often those lists are the same, which I found astonishing, because she and I are such entirely different people with entirely different concerns, but somehow both of us agree on the direction of the story, so on the integrity of that particular story and how it needs to be told. So we then work together, and I am extremely fortunate in having an editor who reads books. Those of you who are getting started in the publishing world will find this. A problem is that editors don't have time. They just don't have time. They get a book, they like it, they tidy it up a little bit, they hand it over to the copy editor, and that's it. So you get a book that really should have been carefully edited and isn't. And that's even with big publishing houses. It's not, not just the Kindle ones that people have published themselves. My editor, I don't think she sleeps. So she will actually read my book several times. I mean, I think some of the books she's read 4 or 5 times, which is unheard of in the industry, and I'm, as I said, extremely lucky. That then is, that's finished about maybe 5 or 6 months before the book is due to come out. At that point it goes to the people who set it, the typeset it, and the copy editors, and I then get the copy editing back and tear my hair because they made all kinds of corrections that I hated. And then eventually I get these beautiful proof pages that have just a few little remarks. And at that point I actually read it aloud, because you get these weird echoes. Do a lot of you listen to audiobooks? Yeah, they're tremendously popular now. And I think it's changed the way a lot of us write, because hearing a book is different from seeing it on the page. For one thing, the he said, she said, you notice it a lot more if it's coming in your ear. Whereas if it's just on the page, your eye just kind of treats it as a period. So I tend to leave those out more than I used to. Not so much with the Russells, because she has her own way of talking, but certainly in lockdown, there's a lot fewer of them. And then it goes out to the bound galleys. You've probably seen those. They're the paperback early version that have some mistakes in them still, because they're printed off the proofs. And those are the things that go around to bookstores, and lots of libraries get them for their buyers. And they say very polite things, and they order some copies. And then the book comes out, and I come around and talk to people, and I sign them. So that's the sort of process that a book goes through. Very different from self-pub. Do we have any self-pub authors here? Yeah. Yeah, the self-pub is it's great in some ways because it gives you full control, and it's a real nightmare in others because it gives you full control. And you don't have anyone to blame for it. It's one of the things, so I should mention MWA, Mr. Writers of America, has now opened up its active status members to people who self-pub. This took them only about 20 years to do. And we're having a number of events that are aimed at self-publishing people, because it's a huge set of questions that you come into when you say, I want to publish this book myself, and then you have 8 million questions that come, and you think, I don't know, maybe I'll just leave it in my drawer. So that's the kind of writing process. Yeah.
Does Random House demand of you to be
My firstborn, yes.
Yeah, well, besides that, up to speed, like on all the social platforms? Like, do you have to have a blog? Do you have to do Instagram? Do you have? I mean, a lot of publishers are just because they're young. The editors are younger, so they want to push that.
Yeah. This is one of my pet peeves.
Yeah.
In fact, there is a conference every year, which I'm sure is extremely helpful to many people, up in San Francisco, that is run by a couple of agents. And they apparently have, as the basis of their program, the idea that all new authors need to have a platform before they can take their book to a publisher. And people like me look at them and say, how can you have a platform if you don't have a book? What can you possibly attract in the way of attention? If you haven't a backlist, if you don't have a single book, if you don't have anything that people can react to. So there was this one poor woman who I happened to sit next to her at the dinner that they had for a number of us. And I said, so what have you learned? And she said, when I go home to Honolulu, I have to do and she started ticking these things off of, building her Facebook list and starting on Twitter and doing an Instagram. And I just folded her hand up and I said, no, you need to go home and write. You need to go home and write. And then when you finish writing, you need to write some more. And, it just makes me crazy when people think, well, for one thing, who think that you can sell books because of social media. They really are two different things. I mean, I have quite a list of people who join my Facebook and buy my blogs, and the most I can count on is that if they're already going to buy the book, they see that it's come out on one of my media accounts, and they say, oh yeah, I was going to buy that, and so they'll order it. They're not convinced to buy anything because I say, please buy this book. They're not convinced to buy anything because I post pictures of my cat or my children or my grandchildren or whatever. It's part of the community, yeah. And one of the things that I love about being a writer is that there is this weird community that comes together around, especially around the Russell books. And it's but to regard that as being a part of your professional life is very shaky. But that's just.
But Random House doesn't push you to do it.
I'm sure it does for some writers, especially for new writers. I mean, I've been there since the 90s. They know that I'm not going to do anything. No, I mean, I do a lot of stuff for them, but every so often they'll say, how about doing this? And I'll say, no, I'm not going to do that. That's stupid. One of the things that they haven't figured out yet is if you're doing something half-hearted, you really should just not do it, because it comes across. I mean, if you only post on Instagram when you have a new book out that you want people to buy, if your Twitter account is only active when you're doing an event or you have something to say, no, it's not doing anyone any good. So, but that's how I feel.
I'm very interested as a huge Holmes fan. What went into your decision about choosing Holmes as a character? And were you a Holmes fan? Did you think about a possible strategic advantage and as well as the pitfalls of picking such an iconic character?
The question is about Sherlock Holmes. Why did I pick him to live with? Can you imagine anyone less attractive to live with than that man? It'd drive you nuts. I wanted to write a coming of age book about an extraordinary young female mind. And I was interested in the idea of what would it look like if Sherlock Holmes were a young female 20th century person rather than this Victorian upper class male? What would he look like? How would she be different, and how would she be the same? So that's really where Russell came from, is the idea that, you know, that women's minds work that way too. And in fact, I think women's minds work that way more often. I think that it's dismissed as women's intuition, that when Holmes do it, you have this little chorus of people saying, Holmes, how do you do it? But, you know, mothers do it all the time. And yet, you know, what is fascinating about the character is not just his cleverness, not just his ability to put things together as a puzzle, but the fact that he throws himself body and soul into the pursuit of righteousness. I mean, that to my mind is the extraordinary thing about the character, is how utterly committed he is to his work. And I wanted to make Russell like that. I wanted to make her equally difficult, equally brilliant, and yet more human, because I think that's one of the things that you're really missing with the character. You have to have the Dr. Watson character to get a sense of Holmes's human side, and I wanted to go past that. So.
Did you have any, because those stories are written, I guess maybe turn of the century, there weren't copyright issues when you use a character?
Was there copyright issues? No. 8 of the stories are still under copyright. The last 8 of them that he wrote in the 20s. But if you are interested, there is a website called Free-Sherlock, which is about the court case that went to the Supreme Court about the copyright question that a friend and I pursued under his name, but he and I worked together on it. So, against the Conan Doyle estate, which basically said everybody had to pay them royalties.
Just to use Sherlock Holmes' name?
Yeah, and in fact they didn't. So.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I have a question about Lockdown,
Mhm.
which I've started
Oh,
reading.
good, Lockdown.
Yeah. I haven't finished it. The first question is, why you chose a fictitious place, San Felipe, and not Santa Cruz or Watsonville, unless San Felipe really does exist. But then the other one is about your craft, about emissions, and that fine line. I mean, I'm like maybe 30 pages, and the husband of the principal has done something, but we don't know what it is, and so,
Yeah,
so I'm going, wait a minute, did I miss something?
Yeah.
Do I have to go back and reread?
No,
Or,
no, you don't.
I think I'll keep going
you don't.
forward.
You don't
Yeah.
have to
And then
reread.
you did it again. You did it again with B.
Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, how do you?
Yeah, it's a very
do
different
that.
kind of writing. Lockdown is really a different kind of writing. I chose to make it a fictitious town for a number of reasons. Mostly because it freed me up to change things that weren't convenient. So that instead of having, it's based on a school that is sort of where our Mesty school is, but that's not a middle school and it's not laid out that way. So, rather than fit into the roads and patterns and, the structure of the police department and all that, I used artificial names. I mean, very recognizable. If you know Watsonville, you know what I'm talking about. But I think that I do that with most places where I'm doing changes. San Francisco, when I write about San Francisco in the Martinelli books, that's San Francisco. And if you write about something that's there, for the most part it's there. One-way roads are usually accurately portrayed. Sometimes they change them and people write and say, that's no longer a one-way road. Sorry, it was published in 1993. There's nothing I can do. But if I'm changing the layout of a place, or the personality, or indeed if if you're writing about a restaurant that sort of kills somebody, because it poisons them, you don't want to use a real one. You really don't. But as for the way the book goes together, I mean, I was really interested in how, the book is made of small parts, and each one has a time frame, so that you're following this community from shortly after midnight afternoon, and each one is these different characters and what they're doing, and sometimes you see the same scene from two different points of view. Sometimes you see the same person in several times. And what I was working to get in, especially in the first section, is I always hate those books that you end up turning back and forth and trying to see who was who, and that admission of defeat when you have just a list at the front. I fought my editor on the one. There's sort of one in the front of this one, a kind of one, and I fought her on it. But she said, I'm just going to put it in there. Because I think that the ideal is that you're looking at this community, and that's what I wanted to get. I mean, this is a community, and you learn early on, in fact, from the title, you sort of guess it, that a gun comes to school. There's a middle school that's having a career day, and a gun comes to school. And all of these people feed into the situation both beforehand and what happens after it comes. And that it has to be absolutely tight for it to work. I mean, the pieces of this one are, have you ever seen those kids' toys where you have all these little dials with gears, and you punch them into the thing, and if you turn one, you have this little bunch of stuff that goes like this, and the last one turns. Very satisfying. And that's the kind of thing that it needed to be. Everything's so closely meshed together that you knew that this was the community you were looking at. So no, you don't need to go back and figure things out, because it's not there. You will learn it. What you need to know, you will learn. Yeah.
I am curious, were you always a writer, and how did you break in to getting published?
Was I always a writer? No, I didn't really start writing until I was in my 30s. My kids were in school 3 glorious mornings a week, and it freed me to write. And so I sat down and started The Beekeeper's Apprentice and went from there. I think if you had told me that I was going to write, 10 years before, I would have assumed that what I was doing would be science fiction, because that's what I was reading a lot of. But my brain seems to prefer the structure of crime stories, the skeleton of the story. So, there was a second part of it.
Well, just like, once you were avidly writing and taking your work and getting published, how did you break in there?
Yeah, how did I break into publishing? Yeah, I remember when I was, I guess the second book, it was when Beekeeper's Apprentice was out, and there was a conference, and somebody said to me that I had just sprung overnight from the head of Zeus. and I thought, that's a pretty slow spring, because it would be about, 6 years by the time So, yeah, I started writing in 87, and was first published in 93. During that time, I had tried the business of sending it myself, and that just made me crazy. It just drove me nuts. So I found an agent in San Francisco, and she was my agent until just a couple books ago. So yeah, I've been traditionally published, and still am. But we publish some individual short stories, just by ourselves. But for the most part, traditional. Yeah.
I had a question about Kate Martinelli's series. So what happened to her? And what was the process for you? Did you get so tired of her, uninspired by her?
The question is about poor old Kate Martinelli. Yeah. you know, the problem is that everybody loves Russell, which is not a problem, but it means that everybody loves Russell, and so so the publishing houses like it when they have something that people love, and we're working ourselves up to a problem this year, in fact, because I don't want to do a series of Russells. I want to do a Russell and then another Russell. The problem is that a book like Lockdown doesn't sell as well. So, you know, I then have to go back to them and say, yeah, it'll sell fine in the long run, won't it? And I really would like to do another Martinelli. But if I wait for them to buy it, that's one question, or if I do a self-pub, I have to fit that in between my other things. So it's, you know, I would like to write another Martinelli. One of the things that I think would be particularly interesting is there's a company who has bought an option for the Martinellis. In fact, both the Martinellis and the Russells are under option at the moment, which means nothing. But, you know, it's, if they go ahead with it, it would mean that I got to write another one, so that would be fun. So, but we'll see. Yeah, I agree.
What's the difference in structure between a crime novel and a cozy?
Oh, it's, yeah. I think
And the
that
what?
the difference between a crime novel and a cozy, there's a lot of words that are thrown out at various kinds of mystery books. And we in this country tend to use the word mystery. In England, you tend to talk crime instead. But in any case, a crime novel is on a spectrum between the traditional mystery, which the cozy is the most traditional of the mysteries, where you have, you know, a body, a very tidy body, preferably in a library. And then you have, you know, clues and suspects and an investigator and a denouement and a solution. And that's the sort of, it's a very cerebral kind of mystery and usually has a lot of interesting stuff to go with it. The other end of the spectrum is the pure thriller. And the pure thriller is all emotion. It's all edge of the chair, beat of the heart, tick of the clock. And in between those two are, you know, most of us, I write what's called suspense, which is sort of in between. I mean, they have a puzzle to them, there's a whodunit aspect, but there's also a time pressure and there's a sense that it's closing in on the heroes. So, you know, it's sort of, people who don't like traditional mysteries usually call them cozies because it's derogatory. I know certain people who refer to my stuff as cozies, and that's fine, except when it's certain people who refer to my stuff as cozies when it's just an insult. But you know, I'm fine. They are cozies. They are people. They are books you can give to your grandchild or your grandmother, and I'm fine with that. Not all my books are that way, but
You and Louise
certainly there are
Penny and Elizabeth George, they're more than cozies, they're
Yeah.
thick.
Yeah.
But do they have a particular structure, though, like you three girls, is there a structure that you have in common with your crime novels that they share?
As I say, I think that I would categorize Louise Penny and Elizabeth George and a lot of other writers as suspense, just because they're sort of somewhere in between the classic. I mean, the classic cozy mystery, you never really get a sense of death. I mean, you really, it's the thing that starts the puzzle off, but you never really feel the agony of death. And you never feel the need for revenge or punishment. I mean, because it's a puzzle, it's a cerebral puzzle. Whereas, as I say, with the thriller end of things, you quite often know who did it, who is going to do it, who wants to do it, at the very beginning, because the whole thing is, can we stop them? So, and the suspense novel is somewhere in between. Usually with suspense novels, and almost always with mine, you go a long time before you discover who done it. I think that's part of the game that you play with your reader, is you offer red herrings and you offer possibilities, and you offer as well the option of understanding these people. Because with a suspense story, with a really good suspense story, your villain is, I mean, as far as he's concerned, he's the hero. And I think when you have a two-dimensional villain that just is there to get the thing moving and to work against, it undermines the story. I think with Lockdown, you feel the person who ends up having done it, and you can see why he just broke. And that's what you're looking for in my kind of story. I think that's the reason why I love my genre, is that it enables me to tell stories about the reality of suffering and the triumph of going past that. I mean, with Lockdown, it's not about a book it's not about a gun that comes to school. It's about the community and how they react. Yeah.
Did you have any say in the selection of Jenny Sterling for the narrator of Mary Russell's?
No, Jenny Sterling's really great. She's the person who reads the audiobooks, the Mary Russell audiobooks. I never have a say with anything like that, but it was I think a really good choice, and people seem to like her. She's a lovely woman. I've met her a couple of times. It's a very specific voice of Mary Russell that can't have been easy to catch. Because it's amusing and yet it isn't. It's American and yet it's English. So
she did that on her own, without your...
Yeah. Yeah, no, they never asked me. Yeah.
Do you have any advice for aspiring writers?
Aspiring writers' advice. Write. And then read and then write. Yeah, I think that, the only way you can learn to write is by writing. And I think a lot of people find writing groups, writing classes, writing courses, how-to books helpful as ways of kind of showing you possibilities. But basically it's a job that everyone has to teach themselves. I mean, the way I write is not the way anyone else writes. And the way, every so often I'll come across somebody who writes in a way that makes you think, how on earth do you do that? I mean, Diana Gabaldon writes in scenes. She'll just write one scene after another, and then she sort of puts them together in a way that to her makes sense. Okay. I can do that to a certain extent, but an entire however many 100 pages. She's an interesting person, Diana is. Let's have maybe one more question here.
What do you read?
What do I read?
What do you enjoy reading?
Oh, that's a different question. What do I read and what do I enjoy reading?
You said you did.
Yeah, at the moment, you do a lot of research reading and a lot of stuff that is kind of semi-research. At the moment, I'm reading a lot about Venice because I'm working on a book set in Venice in 1925. So I'm reading. It's amazing how things can parallel modern life. I'm reading about Mussolini. I need say no more to this crowd. I read a certain amount of crime. I especially like to read crime mysteries if I'm not writing full out. But I find that when I'm working heavily on a book, my brain just can't do it, and so I need to go and do something else. So I'll read a lot of science fiction or biographies that have nothing to do with Venice in 1925 or that kind of thing. But yeah, I read a lot of crime. Okay, I thank you so much for coming out. I'm happy to sign the book. And I wish you all good luck with your own writing.